Alright guys, so I had to re-record the audio because of copyright stuff, so I apologize for any kind of discrepancies. But in this part of the video we are going to be cross-cutting the material. So the first thing, before we can actually mark any of the material, we've got to actually make sure it is cut to length. The reason for that is if we start cutting things and we realize that the end we were measuring from wasn't square, all of our measurements are going to be off. So what we're going to be doing is using the panel saw, which is this machine. It's a type of table saw, and we are going to first cut a small section off of one end, and then we are going to flip the depth gauge down, or the stop gauge, which for this one was set to I believe it was set to 37.5 inches. I don't have my notes in front of me, but it was set to whatever the depth or the length of the front legs. So we were going to trim up one end, make sure that's square, and then we're going to use that newly squared edge to register against our stop gauge to get the exact length that we need. So while we're doing this, we're going to keep pressure, one, down against the actual table, and then two, back against the fence. That way it can stay as square as possible. Once we cut the first end, we're going to flip the material over, keeping the same face against the fence. The reason for that is in case there's any kind of little wiggles or the sides not fully flush, it's going to transfer that same angle on both sides. That way it's going to still remain square. Alright, so those were the two front legs. So now we're going to move on to the back legs, and these ones are something around 57.5 inches, I believe. They're longer than the front legs because they also accommodate that top half shelf. So here you'll see me sliding down the stop gauge and resetting that into the new position, but the process is going to be the same. We're going to trim up the first side, then we're going to flip the stop gauge down, flip the piece over, and make that second cut. We're going to do that for both legs, and then we will be done cross-cutting. Alright, so now that all four legs are cut to length, now we can actually start marking out where these mortises are supposed to go. And again, the reason we have to do the cross cuts first is because we need to make sure everything is square. Alright, so for this portion, what we're going to be doing is marking out where we need to drill out the material. That way the tenons can go into these legs in the appropriate position, making sure everything is square, everything is level, and all that. So the first thing I did was I marked an F on the front face for all four legs, and on the bottom of the legs I marked a B for bottom. That's just a quick way to reference what is the front face, what is the bottom, to help ensure that our measurements are accurate and are on the appropriate place. One thing that could happen is if I didn't mark top or bottom is I could measure one of the mortises from the top, one from the bottom accidentally at some point, and now all of a sudden if I punch those in that place, they'd be in the wrong spot relative to the other legs. Alright, so right now what we're doing is I'm taking this ruler and I'm going to measure out the different mortises that we need. So with this little scrap of wood that's standing out, that was an offcut from the legs. I'm using that to make sure that the ruler is flush against the bottom of the leg. This is really important because if it's off any bit, that will mean that our measurements are not accurate. So this first mark is at 6 1/4 inches. So I'm just going to put a little tick there. And then we're going to go to 16 1/4. And again, we're going to make a little tick there. And now we're going to 35 1/4, and we're going to make a little tick there. So these are the heights of the starting point for our mortises. So we're just marking it out on this one leg first. Now we're going to take the tri-square, and what we're going to do is, using the shoulder, we are going to draw straight lines across all of the faces at that height for each of those marks that we just made. What this is going to do it will carry on that mark that we made, that one little tick that we made. It'll carry it around to all 4 faces. That way we don't have to individually measure each face. We can just continue this line around and make sure that it is accurate. So at this point I had lost where the tick mark was, so I had to quickly remeasure, and now we found it and we can mark it again. Alright, so one thing to keep in mind is when we are marking these, try our best to use the same reference face for each side. That way, if our tri-square is off a little bit, a degree or two, it will transfer the same angle no matter what. And then once we do the initial marks, we want to actually double check, because it's worthwhile to actually check to make sure that we were accurate. The old adage is measure twice, cut once. Once you make a cut, there's no going back. So it's worth the effort to take the extra 5 minutes, if that, to actually double check our measurements, and that way we know what we're doing is the right thing. Alright, so what I'm talking about here is the concept of a through tenon. So the through tenons, is going to go from one face to the other face all the way through the leg. So what we need to do is we need to make sure our centers on both faces that we're making those cuts are exactly the same, because we're making 2 separate cuts. We're going to go about halfway through on the first face, then we're going to flip it over and go halfway through again. If we're off even by a fraction of an inch, those 2 holes aren't going to line up, and our tenons are never going to actually fit through square. So we need to make sure that all of our measurements are very, very precise for that reason. So while we're transferring these marks onto each face, you'll quickly be able to tell that it's pretty important to put that initial front face mark, because by the time we get done with all 4 of these faces, it's very easy to forget which was the front. Sometimes you want to mark that because that has the most interesting grain. Other times you want to mark it because there's other holes that you've drilled on that face. There might be a number of reasons why you would want to do that. It's just a quick mark, and it helps maintain consistency. That way our measurements are all where they need to be. The other thing to pay attention to while we're doing this is by the time we've transferred these marks over to that last side, our line that goes across every face should connect back to the initial line that we did. If it doesn't connect, something went wrong, and we need to take the time to actually redo those measurements and make sure everything is actually all square. It could be that you didn't hold the shoulder against the reference face. It could be that your material is not square. Whatever the problem is it's going to eventually be compounded once you start making cuts off of those crooked marks. And then none of your material will join together properly, and you'll have a very, very difficult time actually assembling this piece. Plus, once it's assembled, it's likely not going to be square. So again, measurement is very important, and we need to take the time to actually do it right. Okay, so here I'm talking again about the fact that these through tenons are going to be going completely through the wood, and we're going to be cutting on either side, so we need to make sure our centers are correct. If our centers are off, that means the two holes that we make on either side are not going to line up, and then it's essentially going to be forcing our tenon to go through at a diagonal, which means our material is not going to be as strong, it's not going to assemble correctly. Alright, so what I've done here is I've set my tri-square to 1/2 inch, and I've marked it from one side, and then flipping it over to the other side and marking it again. That will ensure that if that line is at the same spot, we know we are dead center. If our line is off any amount, that means we were too much or too small on one side, and we should erase that mark and do it again. For this stock, it was easy. It was 1 inch thick and 1 inch wide. That means our mark needs to be at 1/2 inch. So this was a simple set the tri-square to 1/2 inch, make our marks. The thing to be aware of is when we're drawing our lines, if we set our tri-square exactly to 1/2 inch, then when we draw the line, if we're using the end of the rule, it's not going to be exactly 1/2 inch because there's thickness to the pencil, to the lead, and we're drawing off the end of the rule, which is a little further than 1/2 inch, so we need to be aware of those things. Now the next thing I'm doing is the mortises that we need to punch are not just a single punch. We need these to be 1.5 inches long, or 1.5 inches wide. So what we need to do from that initial baseline that we drew, we need to continue that center mark up 1.5 inches. So we can measure out 1.5 inches, then we can get our tri-square out, and we can mark that top edge of the mortise. What this is essentially doing is giving us a start and stop point for each of the mortises that we've drawn. Without this, it can be very hard to tell if we've gone too far with the travel of the mortise press, or it could be that we don't know if we're registered completely where we need to start, depending on the way that we are feeding the material into the mortise press. So it's always important to mark out start, stop, centers of all of the mortises we're going to be making. Alright, so here what I'm talking about is the fact that only one of our tenons is going to be a through tenon, the other will be a blind or a stop tenon, purely for the fact that once one piece of wood goes